I'd like to welcome everyone to this morning's session on future work and how we ensure dignity and value in future work, and the impact of COVID and the pandemic on working conditions and the value of work. We have two fantastic panelists with us this morning. We have Orla O'Connor, who is the Director of the National Women's Council of Ireland, and we have Laura Bambrick, who is Head of Social Policy and Employment Affairs with the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. Unfortunately, our third panellist for the session, James Bloodworth, isn't able to join us this morning, but I have no doubt that myself, Orla and Laura will have plenty to talk about with your input and assistance. So what we're going to do, we've got a session here which is running up until 12:30, and at the end of this session there'll be an hour's lunch break, and we'd invite attendees to come back and attend the afternoon session at 1:30. I will ask you all, if you're on the Twitter sphere, to tweet using the hashtag leading the way, and we'll be able to see your contributions through that also. So we'll start off with some kind of opening contributions from Orla and Laura, and then we'll be going to a more discussion based style. So Orla, I'm sure, needs no introduction, but just by way of a few opening remarks, Orla is Director of the National Women's Council of Ireland for almost 10 years at this stage. The National Women's Council of Ireland is representative of over 190 member groups, so that's no mean feat in terms of bringing policy objectives and all of that into alignment with each other, and campaigning and achieving those goals. You'll all know, I'm sure, that Orla was a co-director of the Together for Yes campaign alongside the abortion rights campaign and Coalition to Repeal the Eighth. And for this work, she was recognised as one of the 100 most influential people by Time magazine in 2019. So Orla is going to talk to us a bit about, I suppose, the impacts of the pandemic and changes in working styles, and how we value different kinds of labour in light of COVID and the pandemic and all of those things. So I'll hand you over to Orla for her opening remarks, which I'm very eager to hear myself.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to the Sophidens as well for inviting me to participate in this summer school. I really appreciate that, and as Catherine has already said, the Women's Council, we're the leading national feminist organisation campaigning for equality and advocating for women's rights, and we're a membership organisation, and very much for our members, one of our key areas of concern is women's economic equality and independence. And that was also, we've just finished a huge consultation with our members in the formation of our new strategic plan, No Woman Left Behind, and economic equality has come out very much as a real priority for the work of the Women's Council and the campaigns of the Women's Council over the next 5 years. So for this morning, I've been asked to consider the challenges faced by women in ensuring that the workplace of tomorrow is fairer and a more dignified experience. Excuse me. A current look at the current context for women working today clearly shows the range of challenges that women experience, and I'm going to highlight some of those challenges and also what we see as some of the solutions and what needs to be done. So first of all is the issue of low pay, and Ireland has one of the highest rates of low paid workers in the OECD. 23% of the workforce are low paid compared to an OECD average of 15%. But low pay does not affect all groups equally. We know that women and young people are more likely to work in a job that is low paid. 60% of all those earning the minimum wage in Ireland are women. Part-time workers are more likely to count among the low paid. And again, women are more likely to work part-time. During the pandemic, we classified workers according to whether they were essential workers or not. And almost 70% of essential workers are women. And lone parents, again, predominantly women, are overrepresented amongst essential workers. And those essential sectors are amongst the lowest paid in the economy. For example, half of the childcare workforce and more than half of wholesale and retail workers earn less than the living wage. Among undocumented workers, many of whom work in care and other essential sectors, 26% report earning less than the minimum wage. And we also see gender inequalities in access to emerging higher paid and green jobs in STEM areas. As women are less likely to be trained and employed in STEM areas, they may not be benefiting from public investment in green jobs if this investment is only focused on industrial areas. And contrary to our policy aims, the proportion of women working in higher paid sectors, such as information and communications technology in Ireland, actually decreased from about 30% in 2004 to 21% in 2017. So the second area to highlight in terms of the challenges is the whole area of precarious work. And many of the sectors where women work in are also the most precarious. Many childcare workers, for example, along with school secretaries, rely on summer month social welfare payments to survive. There is analysis from NERI to show that 42% of recent employment growth came from sectors with above average risk of precariousness. And this is something that we need to consider when we're having conversations on activation and recovery from COVID. So we need to look at, are we investing in supporting the development of low paid jobs with precarious conditions, or are we investing and supporting decent jobs with good terms and conditions that will support us all in making a just transition? And the third area to look at is the area of labour market participation. And the pandemic has affected women's labour market participation in multiple and complex ways. While absolute unemployment may have increased more for men during the pandemic due to their greater labour market participation, the relative increase was higher for women. The sectors most affected by restrictions have been ones in which women predominate. But we have also heard from women who have had to leave work simply because they simply can no longer continue to manage the competing demands of work, care of children at home, the impact of the homeschooling, and so on. So what we're seeing is that women are losing their connection to the labour market. And this is obviously an area that needs more research and more discussion. But we certainly know that a significant number of those whose employment was affected by the pandemic expect not to return to the same job, with more women likely to report this in comparison to men. And young workers also make up, and it's about 44% of those who do not expect to return to the same job. Again, data from NERI suggests that married women between the age of 25 and 34 have been particularly affected by the pandemic. The labour market participation of young married women has not been as low since before the financial crisis as well. But before even the onset of the pandemic, women's labour market participation was lower than that of women. And overall figures hide differences in the labour market participation, particularly for marginalised women. Ireland has the lowest rate of employment among disabled people in the EU, and traveller women are all but excluded from the workplace, with 80% of traveller women unemployed. And I think that is such a stark statistic. We won't address these issues without acknowledging that there are gender inequalities here and that we need to provide targeted supports for women. And I'll talk a bit more about that in terms of the solutions. As it stands, women are much less likely to benefit from active labour market programmes than men. Around 65% of those benefiting from a CE scheme or a TUS place are men, and less than 1 in 5 beneficiaries of the Rural Social Scheme are women. And really, very starkly, only 5% of beneficiaries of investment in apprenticeships were women in 2020. And then finally, not finally, actually, 2 more in terms of the challenges. One is just in relation, it's comment in relation to the gender pay gap. We know that the unequal division of care is a key contributor to the gender pay gap. But even among young workers, there is a gender pay gap, with female workers under 25 earning 19% less than comparable males in 2018. And while the recently enacted Gender Pay Gap Information Act represents significant progress, it's certainly not as comprehensive as we would have liked it to be. And we've not even begun to get to grips with ethnicity or disability pay gap in Ireland, though it is an absolute reality for many disabled women, traveller women, and Black and ethnic minority women. And finally, in terms of the challenges, is the issue of low collective bargaining coverage. And I'm sure I won't do justice to this in the way that Laura will, but research has indicated that countries with a high coverage of collective bargaining tend to have reduced gender pay gap, as well as shorter working hours for both women and men. They tend to have more flexible work options under secure employment conditions and better protection for non-standard workers. So collective bargaining, in our view, is one of the most effective ways to create a more equal distribution of wealth and address low pay. But the challenge arises as the proportion of employees covered by collective bargaining agreements in Ireland is very low. Legislation as recommended by the Citizens Assembly on gender equality, and I'll be mentioning that a fair bit I think this morning, is of particular necessity in Ireland, as our laws allow employers not to recognise unions in pay disputes. Unions are often not recognised and joint labour committees don't exist in many of the sectors that women predominate. So this is an area that we really want to see a focus on. I want to touch on the issue of care because I think this is such a critical issue and has become very heightened, I think, as well, both in the pandemic and as we come into this period of recovery. Because underpinning much of the inequality that women experience in the world of work is the continuing and persistent unequal division of care and a continuing state failure to invest in the care economy. Our work and welfare model continues to be built around a full-time work model, but women's working lives and all our working lives are characterised very differently, and particularly in terms of women, by periods of in and out of paid employment and unpaid care work. Part-time work, career breaks, underemployment, work in the informal economy, all of these are features of women's working lives that result in lower incomes, reduced access to pensions and other social protections. They also result in fewer women at senior decision-making levels. They put women at greater risk of poverty, and also where women have less time to take part in education and training. And I think it's really important to say, have fewer opportunities to participate in many aspects of life, and also in political and cultural life. And we've seen during the pandemic just how vital care is to a functioning economy and society, and of course to a functioning labour market, which is why I think it's so disappointing that in all the plans that have been developed over the past year in terms of recovery, you know, from the budget to the National Economic Recovery Plan, our plan for EU recovery, for the EU Recovery and Resilience Fund, that there has been a real failure to acknowledge and invest in the care economy. It's like this whole issue of care that has resulted, you know, that has become heightened in the pandemic is as quickly falling to the wayside again. The insufficient provision of childcare is a central reason as to why employment rates among women are lower, and yet we continue to have one of the most poorly funded systems in the EU. And it's not just in caring for our children that women put in more hours than men, because we can also see it happening later in life in that it still is falling disproportionately on women. Paid parental leave schemes absolutely help parents to balance work and family life and to maintain their connection to the labour market. However, the provision of statutory leave supports for parents in Ireland is much lower than EU norms. And there is a large gap between the end of paid leave and the start of early years services. The pandemic has reinforced existing gendered patterns of unpaid care and work and increased the care demands within household due to the impact of lockdowns. While in some households, men may have taken on more care than what they previously would have undertaken, all available data shows a significant disproportionate amount of care that is still being done by women. And I think that is so critical that as we come out of this and we look at our new forms of working, how we address this. So just to touch on the solutions, I'm conscious of my time. I've put out, I suppose, the challenges, but in terms of the solutions, I think one of the things really that is important to highlight at the summer school is the recommendations of the Citizens Assembly on gender equality. I'm not going to go through them all here, but they do set a very clear pathway in terms of issues around the living wage, around collective bargaining, about better paid parental leave, and I think really importantly about the emphasis on public services and public childcare and adequate social welfare services. So we need to look at creating a society that has a care economy at its centre. And that was very clear, I think, within the recommendations of the Citizens Assembly. It also means that we need to deliver flexible work models that ensure workers have time for care, but also recognising that greater flexibility is no substitute for reduced working hours. And it's one of the reasons why the Women's Council is part of the 4-day week campaign, which has been led by Forsa. So we need to see investment in our public services, particularly public childcare and social care. We need to see real choices for people in their older years with regard to the care they need, and care that gives them both dignity and much more, I suppose, than adequacy. And I think that is really critical. So I think maybe I'll finish with that and then follow up with questions that may come later on many of the areas that I've addressed. So thank you, Catherine.
That's great, Orla. Thank you so much for that contribution. I would encourage anybody attending at home to use the questions and answer function if you want to put any thoughts or any questions into that, and we'll be bringing those to Orla and Laura following Laura's contribution. So I suppose at this point we'll go to Laura then. Laura is the Head of Social Policy and Employment Affairs at the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, and Laura has a very extensive and impressive background, having worked in policy and social justice with St. Vincent de Paul, having worked as a policy advisor in the Office of the Taoiseach, having worked in the Office of the United Nations Assistant Secretary General, and as I say, is currently working with ICTU, which is a representative body for 45 unions across the country. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts, Laura, on, I suppose, the challenges in terms of working from home and the positives that brings, but also I suppose the potential for difficulties, and how we might address that and prevent those occurring.
Thanks, Catherine, and good morning to everybody that's taken the time to listen in on this beautiful Saturday morning. We've had a run of rainy Saturday mornings, but it's sod's law. We have the sun beaming out on us this morning. So I am going to take the opportunity I have available to me for my opening remarks to talk about the dark underbelly of remote working. We've heard so much about everything that is good for remote, and there is many things in its favour. But I just wanted to take this opportunity to outline some of the trade unions' concerns around remote working. And of course, I want to qualify my remarks by saying that trade unions are very supportive of the move to remote work. We've been leading the way in ensuring that it remains a permanent feature of work practices post-pandemic, because we recognise that when remote working is done right, that's an important qualification. When it's done right, it can have huge benefits to the individual worker, their family, for the business itself, for communities, and for the environment, which is an increasing concern. But our concern is that it doesn't come at the cost of decent jobs. So I'm going to use some PowerPoints to help structure my, let me see, hold and control, see if I can open it. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. Everybody can see that? You see that, Catherine? Perfect. Let me see if I can get it up. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you through 4 pinch points. The first 2 around the individual. So unless you've been on holiday for the last 2 weeks, and lucky you would have heard a lot of media commentary talking about pay cuts for remote work. And this story is originating from the US, the big tech companies based in the US. And it shouldn't really come as a surprise that this is originating from the US, because pre-pandemic, when a company had offices in different states, it has different payment rates, and that's to reflect differences in the cost of living. And it's the same with their minimum wage. Their minimum wage is set at the state level, again, to reflect the cost of living. But we've also heard talk of pay cuts to civil servants coming from our other neighbours, coming from the UK. And the reason why it's starting there is because their civil servants are paid a London rating. That's a top-up allowance that reflects the additional cost of working and living around the capital city. Now, the good news for Irish workers is we have neither. We don't have the geographical spans of the US, where different outlets around the country have different pay rates, and we don't have a habit of paying geographical pay premiums such as the London weighting. However, that's not to say that we don't expect some employers to be trying it on, but we don't expect it to be as big of an issue as larger countries will see and countries with regional pay premiums. However, what we are seeing is that many, if not most, remote workers are already experiencing a pay cut by stealth. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when workers moved to working remote, they started paying the business operational costs through paying higher utility bills, higher electricity, phone bills, in some cases higher home insurance to cover the cost of the materials they now had in their home. And the commentary has been very much, well, you know, it swings and roundabouts. You're not paying money getting to the office anymore, and you're not paying the cost of having your lunch outside of home. So the additional money you're paying in utility charges is balancing out with the savings that you're making not being working from the office. That's not how it works. Your boss never called you into the office every time Dublin Bus put up the prices of their tickets, or the toll fees went up, or the cost of filling your car, or the cost of picking up that sandwich when you were eating out. They don't have rights to call dibs on any savings you're making while you're working. Your pay rates are set based on the value from what you produce, not how much it costs you and how long it costs you to get to your place of work. But trade unions have been very clear about this, that workers shouldn't be left shouldering the business costs in the move to work remotely. Now, government has listened to what we've said to a point, and they've agreed to undertake a review of how working from home expenses are dealt with. And we'll expect that review to come out in the next week or two ahead of the upcoming budget in October. So we'll wait and see what happens there. Another area of concern for individual workers is around the surveillance of staff. And this is part of a wider, a growing trend that we are seeing in the use of artificial intelligence by employers. They're using it in deciding who they'll hire, who gets a bonus, who gets promoted, who's up for early retirement. And I'm sure many of the listeners today will be familiar, I think I've spelled surveillance wrong, I'm only noticing that now, will be familiar of workers in large distribution centres having to wear a tracking device similar to our Fitbits that measure their productivity. Workers that work on delivering, they have to keep their satisfaction ratings high enough or they risk being deplatformed, unable to access employment on the different delivery platform services. And probably closer to home, if you have applied for a job recently, more often than not now, it's all done online. Before you can access the online application form, you have to pass a quasi personality test. And that's AI making sure that you're a good fit for the organisation. But it was really when the majority or the large numbers of us started working remotely that the use of AI in the management of working really went mainstream. And how this software works, if people aren't familiar, is like it's running at the back of your laptop and it's counting the number of keyboard stroke and mouse clicks you do every few minutes. It's taking screenshots, it's looking at your web browsing history and how soon or how quick you take to respond to emails and things like that. But we're also seeing examples of more informal surveillance where workers are expected to keep their laptop camera and microphone on to be available for impromptu call-ins from their line manager. Now, while workers have protections under privacy, you have a right to privacy at work, and that right travels with you while you're working from home. Workers currently don't have protection if they're discriminated against AI. So we really need workers' rights to keep pace with technological change. And it's not just unions saying this. The EU themselves, earlier on in the summer, they came out and they ranked the use of AI in the labour market as high risk. So the Irish Congress of Trade Unions are calling on government to start regulating around this use of AI broadly in employment, but in particular around remote work as we move to more permanent remote working. So then the other areas of concern are more the societal impact. So we've looked at the micro at the level of the individual, now for more society. Congress are concerned when we hear certain politicians espouse the benefits of remote working, the work-life balance, and that is being taken as shorthand for, well, if you can't access childcare or you can't find affordable housing, why not move out of the city down into rural Ireland and work remote? Remote working shouldn't be taken as a replacement for public services. If that's going to happen, what we're going to see is it's going to become mommy tracked. It's going to become highly feminized. And as Orla touched on there, once sectors become highly feminized, we see what happens. The wage levels fall down, the terms and conditions soon disappear. And we know from research in the US that when you're working remotely and your manager is office-based, you're more likely to be overlooked for training opportunities and promotion. So this is something that we'll have to be very alive to, those two things, remote being seen as a replacement for public service and that remote becoming highly feminized. And sort of leading on from that, we're concerned about what we're seeing emerging, what we term the Zoom divide. This privilege gap, work-life privilege gap emerging between those of us who are lucky to be in jobs that facilitate us and allow us to work remotely and those in jobs that require a physical presence. And while we can fall into the trap of thinking of remote and flexible working as a nice perk to the job, for many workers, having the rights to flexible working is very much what will determine their ability to stay in and rejoin the labour market. So how do we avoid this? Well, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, we're looking for the current legislation that will extend the right to flexible working to be extended and give workers the right to all types of flexible working. So that includes the right to go part-time, the right to do split shifts, do some work early in the morning and some work later in the evening, maybe work term time, so you're not working during the school breaks, and things like that. And there's nothing blue sky thinking about this. This is a right workers up the road in Northern Ireland have, across in the UK, and right across the EU and rich economies. So we're just asking government to bring us into line with other workers' rights. And we raise this in our evidence to the recent Citizens' Assembly on gender equality, and they recognise this, and we were delighted that they made it one of their recommendations that all workers have the right to request flexible working. So just to end on that, to again say that trade unions aren't looking to hold back the tide of progress. We're big supporters of remote working. There's a huge appetite in our memberships to continue with remote and blended working arrangements when the restrictions are lifted. But our concern is that it doesn't come at the cost of decent jobs, and that existing workers' protections that are in place are fit for purpose as more of us move to remote working. A lot of our rights and employers' responsibility were designed under the assumption that we would be working in our employer's premises. So there might be some tweaking there, and where there's gaps, that legislation will have to be filled. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to take any questions on that. I hope have I exited that okay?
Yes, thank you very much, Laura. That was very informative and thought-provoking. There are certainly, I would agree with you, there are huge advantages to being able to remote work, and it, you know, potentially will give a lot of work-life balance back to people, but there are certainly huge issues around how we protect workers' rights and how we ensure equality for people in terms of that access to remote working. What we might do now is we have a Mentimeter question, I believe. So somebody delightful is behind the scenes setting up the screen and making sure that this all runs to plan. So thank you very much for that. You can all, anybody listening in can go to www.menti.com, and if you use the code 19908299, you can find this question and respond to it, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. The question that we're looking at right now is what positives can be brought forward from changes to working practices during the pandemic? And there are some answers there that you'll be able to see on the screen in terms of people's thoughts on this. I fully agree. I see popping up here, not having to travel all over the country for meetings that can be done remotely. And I have to say, in my work experience, that might also reduce a bit of the conflict between people in Dublin and people outside Dublin, and the people outside Dublin feeling they're getting a raw deal because they're always the ones who have to travel. So that's interesting to see. Some of the other answers coming up here are flexibility, money saved on transport, the ability to take breaks from work when needed, more time with family, which I think is huge for people, as long as Laura has said, we sort of protects people's rights around that and make sure that it doesn't become, having more time with your family, but trying to balance a lack of childcare and working and all of that. So technological solutions, paperless offices, they're coming in hard and fast here. More time spent in the local community. That's a very interesting one for me, because I'm obviously a local councillor, and I'm very involved with some local community organisations. And I find the kind of 9 to 5 plus Monday to Friday model that we've established actually blocks a lot of people out of participating in their local communities and community organisations because they simply don't have the time. So, giving that time back to people to be involved locally is very important. I see here more inclusion for disabled people. And I think that's an issue that's really come up over the course of the last year and a half, that many disabled people are saying, why were these practices not made available to us, when we requested that meetings could be held online or that greater accessibility could be given. And yet, in light of the pandemic, it has been possible to provide those accessibility options. So I think that's an important one, certainly. I see here recognizing the value of retail workers, and I think that's absolutely huge, because there are so many people working in the retail sector whose work has been undervalued over years, who work often in difficult conditions with a public who can, in my own retail experience from the past, be difficult to deal with. And these are workers we have hugely undervalued, whom the whole COVID situation and the pandemic has shown us are our essential workers. They are literally the people without whom we could not have survived, without whom we wouldn't have had our infamous toilet roll and all the rest. So, these are very much the workers who keep our whole society running, and yet tend to be kind of lower paid, with less benefits, less opportunities for progression, all of those things. So there's a huge number of responses coming in on this, which is great to see. People obviously have a lot of thoughts on it. I like to see solidarity across sectors. I think that's another one that is very important. I would ask you all, if you have any questions for Orla or Laura, if you go to the top right hand of your screen, there's a Q&A function. You can put your questions in, and I'll be able to see them, and Orla and Laura hopefully will be able to see them also, and they'll help guide our discussion to the areas you'd really like to see covered. One of the responses that's come up here on remote working is to be able to move out of the city, savings on rent, more living space. I suppose an opposite to that I'd be interested in hearing maybe Laura's thoughts on this. It's not necessarily completely to do with workers' rights and unions, but it is a thought I've had in relation to the whole working from home, remote working scenario, which is that, for some people, if you live in a kind of, a 3-bed house with a space to work, or an office, or, a substantial space, then you're in a good position to do that. But if you're kind of younger and, given our housing situation, this is extending now for people into their 30s, and you're living in a house share where there are multiple people trying to work from home, and you're potentially either working with a whole pile of other people around your kitchen table, or working out of your bedroom and essentially living and working and sleeping and all of those things in your bedroom. I think that's a bit of a challenge from my perspective, in terms of the different living conditions people have and how working from home works in that scenario. So I'm just wondering, Laurie, would you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, Catherine, so I mentioned in my presentation there are concerns about the Zoom divide, the privilege gap between remote working haves and have-nots. But within those of us who are privileged to be in jobs that can be done remotely, we're not all equally privileged. And you touched on it there, that our living arrangements doesn't allow us all to have the benefits, that spare room that we can convert into an office space, access to broadband. Just we're not all going to have that same work from home experience. Now, to be fair, post-pandemic, we will have the opportunity to work in hubs, the digital hubs that offer the working close to home and having the benefits of the office. And we've been really supportive of the government rollout of this. What is not clear, and hopefully we'll have a bit of clarity on that when we get this review, currently you cannot have any tax rebate, or your employer isn't required to pay the cost of you working from a digital hub. So if your employer decides that, the business is going to go remote 2 out of 3 days a week, and your living arrangements doesn't facilitate you working comfortably from home, but there's a remote hub close to home, who pays, who covers the cost of that? Because they can be pretty pricey. You're talking like possibly 20 euros a day, but if you book it for 5 days a week, you might get it at the bargain of 12 euros. So I mean, 60 euros a day. So if you're not able to afford rent, you're possibly not able to afford to fork out 60 euros a day. So yes, the network of remote hubs will absolutely help bridge that gap between people that want to work, don't want to go into the office. They can work close to home and have all those benefits, but it's how does the cost, the daily desk charge, who has responsibility for that? And is it a taxable, something that you can look for tax relief on? Because at the moment, it's just lighting, electricity, and from last year, broadband. So we really need to catch up with that.
Absolutely. I'm just seeing a question coming in here on the questions and answers, and I'll probably put this to you, Orla. It's around how we get more women represented on state boards, and you know, how they don't currently achieve the diversity level that we'd like to see. And I suppose I'd add to that, not just state boards, but how do we get more women around the table where the decisions are being made? Like, I think in the COVID context, there's been an absolute dearth of female representation in terms of decision-making processes, and, you know, who is, what is prioritized.
Yeah.
You know, so we see, you know, people can go in their droves to GAA matches, but women can't have their partners in maternity hospitals and so on and so forth. So I suppose, how do we get more women to positions where decisions are taken?
Yeah, and I think just to address the question first in terms of the boards one, I mean, I do think that throughout COVID, because we were seeing real absence of women at senior level, I think it's really heightened the conversation. And we recently launched our research report about making a case for quotas for boards, for private boards. And there was a huge interest in it. And I think part of that is reflecting, I think it's two things. One, yeah, absolutely, we could all see the absence of women at senior level. And I also think that there is, I mean, we're certainly seeing it in the Women's Council. There's definitely a sense, and I think it's important, that the pace of change on women's rights and equality is just too slow, and that we're not waiting and you know, we're always waiting, but we don't want to be waiting as long. And I mean, to give an example of the state board situation, I mean, from the time of the decision that was made to introduce a target was in 1993, and it took 25 years. We're only now at 40%. And women and people in Ireland are just not prepared to wait any longer. And that was really reflected in the recommendations as well in the Citizens' Assembly. The Citizens' Assembly were very clear on recommending quotas on boards, in state, public, and across publicly funded bodies. So they went wider, and they also said, and there should be sanctions in place. And I think, while the issue of quotas can be, I know some people have different views on it, but I mean, in the Women's Council, we're very clear that it works. And what I would say, and particularly from that piece of research, it's not so much that, the quote is there and it's a legislative one, so therefore it has to be met, but it acts as a catalyst to make things happen in companies, in workplaces, to bring about that change. And that's the experience in other countries. I mean, we're seeing the same, and Spain has introduced quotas now as well. So quotas are becoming much more of a norm across Europe because of that issue of the pace of change, but also because we can see that once they're there, then they trigger things to happen. All of the soft measures that that everyone is talking about that's needed, but they make them happen at a much quicker pace, and they put the energy and the resources and the priority there. So that's why we think they're really important. And in answer, to the question that came in, do I think there'll be 50% in the next few years? Well, there will only be if there is a quota. There certainly won't be if we just keep doing the status quo, because it's not working. On the wider bit, and there's, I think, two pieces in this. One is, I mean, right across the board, we need to see women at at senior level, at decision-making level. And there are a number of different factors in different sectors that are impacting on that. I mean, for example, there's quite a lot of discussion at the moment. We're going to be having an event on it next week in terms of women's participation in sort of public and political life at senior level, and the impact, for example, online abuse is having. Because we know from our work with young women that online abuse is now becoming one of the biggest factors that's impacting their decision on going forward for positions. And we can also see that as well in women in politics. So there are different factors that are impacting much more on women that are absolutely gendered. And we need to, we really need to address those if we're going to make those changes. But also I think it's important, and it's not just important, it's important for women, it's important for men, is the diversity of our representation. And I spoke earlier just in terms of, and I think it was good, it was mentioned as well around remote working, the really low employment rates for disabled people, even lower for disabled women, but their visibility, their presence. I mean, we're just in a period at the moment of watching the Paralympics, and I've been watching some of the pieces on social media where people are saying, my God, why aren't we seeing this all the time? We're seeing this at one particular time because there's this big event. So there's a whole issue about visibility that really matters in terms of then role models, in terms of going forward for senior leadership, and that's across the board. It's for minority ethnic women, it's for traveller women, it's for disabled women. So there are a number of issues, I think, in answer to what you're saying, Catherine, around this issue. But it's certainly one that we need to address, because we've seen the impact of groupthink. I mean, an example that really hit home for me was right at the start of the pandemic, when we had the issue of women who were on maternity leave and weren't eligible for the wage subsidy payment. And one of the comments that was said to me by a number of people after we had to campaign to get that changed, we had to point out that this was discriminatory. And one of the things that was said back to me was, well, of course it was going to be changed. We just didn't think about it at the time. And when we don't think about it at the time, it is about groupthink. It is about having a group of men in a room who are not thinking about those issues that are critical for women and for women workers.
Thank you very much, Orla. I wanted to pick up on something that I think both of you could speak to, but that Laura raised very much in her presentation. And this is the idea or the potential for kind of remote working to become the mommy track. Like, I think there is a very real and present danger that women will work from home so that they can juggle picking up children from school and providing elder care, which they tend to be more involved in than men, and all of those things. And we will see many men returning to the office at least a few days a week, while women continue to work from home. And the women who aren't seen to be in the office will miss out on opportunities, promotions, training. What do you think we can do? I'll go to you first, Laura, in terms of trying to mitigate against that.
Yeah, there's a catchphrase going around at the moment, work remote if you want a job, but go into the office if you want a career. So it's very much about how do we challenge that? And this is something that has the idea of being present predates the pandemic. The idea that you had to be in earlier than the boss and leave later than the boss as a display of your commitment and your ability. So remote working can be seen as just an extension of that. So the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, we were first to highlight the fact that Irish workers, unlike their European counterparts, didn't have the right to request to work from home. It was or still is until we get the legislation, it's at the gift of your employer to say whether you can work remote or not. Now, there's a European directive coming down the tracks that will give the right to all types of flexible working to the parents of children under the age of 8 and to anybody providing full-time care. But we pointed out that if that right is going to be limited to those two groups, young parents and carers, we are going to see remote working be very feminized. And that was our campaigning charge, to get the legislation that we will see introduced into the Dáil when they return in September, October. So great that the legislation will be there, a definite improvement, but how do we ensure that the take-up isn't, as you said, Catherine, isn't going to be taken up by women predominantly, so that they can use it as a workaround for family and caring responsibilities. It's going to be twofold. It's not just going to be within legislation, but it's going to have to be in that corporate culture, that just because you're not in the office isn't a measure of your commitment or lack thereof to your job. And that's going to be a whole sea change. You've seen many employer business representative groups over the last week chomping at the bit to get their employees back. We've seen from all the figures that productivity hasn't dropped over the pandemic. In fact, we've seen quite the opposite. We have seen a problem with the right to disconnect, workers doing more hours than they're contracted to do, which has more implications for work-life family balance than attending the office. So it's going to be twofold. It's going to be change at the corporate level and corporate thinking, and it's going to be legislative change. What we have got in our favour is, although at the moment we have massive unemployment, that unemployment is concentrated in sectors that can't work remote. They weren't considered essential services, so they weren't allowed open, and they couldn't be done remote, so they became unemployed. So it's still a seller's market for professionals in the labour market. So we would hope that the more enlightened employers that recognise that given workers remote and all types of flexible working will be a real attraction point for attracting and retaining staff. And we're going to see other European countries leading the way. This is not something that's unique to Ireland, and we are in a global labour market for attracting and retaining our staff. So if workers aren't able to get those conditions here, they're going to go to the company in Spain, in Portugal, France, wherever it is that's going to give them to. Is it going to be easy? Is it going to be happening overnight? Not at all, but really mommy tracking, remote working is going to have to be one to watch.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this too, Orla, if you've anything additional you'd like to add around the issue.
I mean, yeah, I would agree with everything that Laura said, and just maybe one thing to add, and from some of the surveys that we were doing throughout the pandemic with women, and probably more recently as well, I think one of the things that's going to be really important in terms of the discussions that are being had with employers about remote working for women, that women are making decisions about employment in the absence of proper public services about care. And I think that is so important in this. You know, so for many women who are talking to us, they're saying, well, it'd be easier to stay working from home because I can manage the fact that the care I have is it's not adequate. It's very difficult to get flexible childcare because of how our childcare model is structured and because of the funding model that's there. So I think there is a real danger in that by default, a lot of women will decide to either, and I mean, I've said that already, we know that in terms of both either returning to work for women who've been out of work in the pandemic, but also the form of work, whether it's remote, whether it's not, whether it's part-time or whether it's not, that so many of those decisions are limited because of our care infrastructure. So we have to get the care infrastructure right in order for workers to be able to make real decisions for themselves with regard to how they want to work. And we know that employers can take advantage of that situation, of knowing the fact, that workers do find it difficult to access childcare. So this is it's a complex piece, excuse me, and it's not, there are, for women making decisions, there are lots of different pieces that impact on those decisions in a way that they don't in relation to men. And so, yeah, I just maybe add that.
Thank you, Orla. I have to say, obviously, kind of not to do too much of a political plug, but I suppose the central tenet of social democracy is that we provide those kind of public services like care and education, that, you know, facilitate people to make the decisions they want to make, not the decisions they're backed into a corner and making. Another question that's come in from one of our audience members, Mark Khan, and I'll go to you first on this, Laura, maybe, because I think from a union point of view, it's going to be a big issue. Working from home and changes to working practices in the pandemic, and before the pandemic, in fairness, the downside possibly of technological advances have led to a blurring of what is work and what is home time. And, you know, that whole issue of the right to disconnect and the right not to be kind of answering your emails at 10 o'clock at night and 7 o'clock in the morning. And I suppose I'm interested to hear what you think in terms of what progress we've made on that, and what we can do as a society to ensure that, you know, we do enshrine that right to disconnect for workers.
Absolutely, Catherine. So again, this was another thing that predates the pandemic. We've seen one of our affiliate unions, the Financial Services Union, had been campaigning back in 2019, pre-COVID, around giving workers the right to disconnect. So that's the right not to have to answer those emails, those phone calls, out of hours. But as soon as we all went remote and were working, you had a lot of people who previously didn't have a company phone, didn't have the laptop with all their work email on it and the various work WhatsApp groups and things like that. So it became a real live issue for people. And added into that, of course, people for the first half of it were also managing homeschooling and elder care responsibility and trying to get out and queue to get into supermarkets. So where employers were facilitating, they were working flexible hours. So people were feeling absolutely overwhelmed that they were trying to get a few hours in here, homeschool, back and work, and in between they had to be available both to their colleagues and to their employers. So we got a commitment in the programme for government where we would get a code of practice around giving workers the right to disconnect. And what that does, as I said, it gives you the right to be able to not to have to answer those calls, but also not to have to do any type of work outside of your agreed hours. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that Sunday evening feeling of there's not going to be enough hours in the next week. I'm going to hop on the laptop, do some hours just to make the workload easier for myself. It gives you protection of not having to do that, but the protection is not to be penalised for not doing that. So you can't be reprimanded and you can't be overlooked for promotion if your colleagues are more eager to do that than you are. So that has been a real positive that has come out of it. We've had interest from trade unions in the UK, in New Zealand and in Canada looking to duplicate that. Now, there is the argument that we actually need legislation, not a code of practice, so we need primary legislation around that. Trade unions are willing. It's only 3 months in operation now, so we'll see how it works, but it was one of those pandemic dividends that has come out, that recognition that we need downtime. The reason that we have statutory minimum breaks and rest time is because it's a health and safety issue. So it's not only, it's not productive for you to be always on, it's really bad for your health and you're at risk to doing a danger to yourself and to others if you're overtired and constantly on. So yeah, we'll see how the code of practice works. It was a positive move. There may be need to push for more, to push for legislation, but we're willing and we're sitting and waiting to see at the moment.
Thank you very much, Laura, for your response on that. A slightly related question, I would say, that's come in on our questions and answers from our Vice Chair, Angela Flynn, is around the 4-day working week, and do we think working from home and remote working will bring us closer to that or not, or what are the steps we need to take? And I know, Orla, you talked about the 4-day working week and NWCI's support for that Forza campaign, and it's something the Social Democrats have kind of come behind as well. It's something we'd be very eager to see. I have some of the same concerns around the 4-day working week that I have around people being able to work from home and other people having to be present, which I suppose are that maybe workers in the retail sector, people who are paid on an hourly basis, how do they kind of slot into that 4-day working week idea? I'm just wondering, have you any kind of further thoughts on it, Orla, you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many issues, you know, that are part of the mix in terms of the 4-day working week. And we're seeing examples in some sectors where, you know, across different countries, because the campaign is looking at this internationally and it's part of an international campaign where the 4-day week is working well. And what we're doing in Ireland at the moment, and what the campaign has just received funding for, is to do a substantial piece of research that would look at how would you do a 4-day week within different sectors, and to look at the differences and to look at the issues, because there are many issues, and you know, we know that as well from our members in terms of how it would work. I mean, I think the benefits that have been highlighted, for particularly, I suppose, you know, from the international perspective, but also from some of the examples in Ireland, are certainly that, you know, benefits in terms of productivity remaining the same, but a much better work-life balance, work-family balance, also environmental benefits, you know, that, you know, some of the ones that we have already discussed. But I think you're right, Catherine. I mean, there are particular issues of how would it work in certain sectors. Some sectors it might work more, you know, more easy, and others that needs to be teased out. And I think what the 4-day week campaign has done, and I actually think it's what it's done quite successfully, is it's really put this conversation about reduced working time on the agenda, which I think is critical, and it's really, really good to see. And we know that this is a long-term campaign and we're at an early stage in it, but I think to have the type of research that we're looking at will really help those conversations. And I think it's really good that you know, that the Social Democrats are part of it. Catherine, can I also, because I'm conscious there's a few questions on the chat in relation to public childcare, and I just like, before we finish, if that's okay, to get to them.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay,
yeah, thank
you. Yes,
because I see there were some questions there about maybe the concern in terms of, well, what's public, and then the questions about should it be a tax credit, and this is something that's, you know, really central to the Women's Council, to the members of the Women's Council, in advocating for a public childcare model, and predominantly because when you look at all of the international evidence in terms of childcare and early years, that is about high quality for children, that's affordable for parents, that has strong gender equality principles, that's where you go. You look to those public models. And I think what we really have, just a completely unsustainable situation in Ireland, where both the workers within the childcare sector, predominantly women, paid such low wages. And we've seen the benefit in the pandemic when the state came in and paid those wages. But this needs to be put on a much more sustainable footing. And also there needs to be real recognition for the high standard that we expect within our early years. So, you know, the whole push is to increase levels of qualification, to degree levels of qualification, and workers have to be remunerated for, you know, for that input. But alongside that, we can't, and I mean, our view in the Women's Council is we can't argue for the state to put in all this investment into a for-profit model, which is what we have currently, where we have a huge number of private providers, you know, beyond the community childcare setting, private providers making profits. So we need to move to that public model, and that's what we've seen across European countries. And we need to start that by things like capping of fees. But so that's the model that we need to go. If we're going to argue for this, and we're right to, for this significant state investment, 1% of GDP, which is the recommended investment, then we need to shift to that public model. And I think it's, there is a new campaign that's been established by SIFTU, which is, very focused on the wages piece. And for the Women's Council, we need to go further. We need to really put up there the public model. And I think, again, really importantly, the Citizens' Assembly have given a very clear recommendation on that.
I have to say, I wholeheartely agree with you, Orla. We need public provision of, quality early years education and childcare, that recognises the rights and acknowledges the role of the providers in that sector and the childcare and education workers, but that also benefits our children. And I think a tax credit doesn't necessarily do that. And my own concerns about a tax credit model would also be that is only then available to people working and receiving a tax credit. Whereas I think, public childcare and early years education is a public good and a public necessity that should be available across the board, regardless of work status. So I would have issues myself with the whole tax credit model in terms of it. I'm wondering, Laura, do you have any particular thoughts on the issue?
Yeah, I suppose to get a bit policy wonky on it, my interest in this is how Ireland differs comparatively to how our other rich European peers do. So a little step back in history, all welfare systems, including those much admired Nordic countries, they were originally designed around the assumption that women were full-time in the home caring and their financial needs would be met by their husband going out earning a wage. And over time, as we became more urban and as more of us start working in factories, we've seen social policies introduced that would facilitate women as well as men working outside the home. What's really unusual about Ireland is we were so late coming to this policy shift, and those gender norms still are so embedded in our public spending, and nowhere is it more visible than in the childcare and the elder care sector. So just looking at childcare, how do we differ from our rich EU peers? Well, it's as Orla said out there, we have a childcare sector that is delivered by private providers. It's a business, where in our EU peers, it's seen as an essential public service. Now, the downside of our market model is, unusually, we don't have a right to a childcare place. That makes us really unusual amongst rich EU countries. And we can't have that because it's private business. So I don't have a right to go into my local dry cleaners and say, I have an expectation that you'll always be available to me on a Friday afternoon, because they're private, where I have a right to send my child to a national school or to have a national education. But preschool and early years, we don't have a right. We also don't have any regulation around fees. As Orla mentioned there, there's no cap on childcare fees. So the mix of having no cap and having a market model, it's no surprise that parents in Ireland have the highest out-of-pocket expenses for childcare. And what does that amount bring in, going full circle to what we started about talking about in Orla's presentation? We have the lowest levels of working mothers in the EU, along with Spain, Italy, and Greece, along with very traditional conservative countries. We're not up there with the 80% of working mothers with young children that we see in the Nordic country. We're down where a third of women with young children are out of the workforce. So it has real implications. The real reason for moving to a public sector model have been outlined by Orla, but it just makes good economic sense. We're losing a lot of that brain power, work power, and all those women with careers being stifled because of the way our absent state when it comes to childcare.
Absolutely, Laura. I'm thinking of an article I read a short while ago about the transition in it was one of the regions of Canada. Now I think it might be in Ottawa, but maybe Quebec. I can't quite remember, but they had a very privatised model, much like our own, and they transitioned to a publicly provided childcare service. Women's workplace participation went up into the 80% level, and actually the increased tax take from that workplace participation meant there was a net there was no additional costs in terms of public purse for that provision of childcare. So, I mean, as you say, it just makes economic good sense, essentially. We are running out of time. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to the two of you. Thank you very, very much. I hope you don't mind, Laura, if we share your slides and your presentation on with our members. And I'll just remind everybody, we're taking an hour's break now for lunch. Our session that we're coming back to in the afternoon is ensuring the cost of transitioning to a zero carbon economy is shared, which, you know, obviously a just transition is vital to the Green New Deal and the transition to a zero carbon economy. So please do rejoin us for that. Thank you so much to Orla O'Connor, Director of the National Women's Council of Ireland, and Laura Bambrick, who's Head of Social Policy and Employment Affairs at ICTU. It's been an absolute pleasure and lots of food for thought. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.